Steve Harvey had been doing promotional appearances for Family Feud for over 15 years, and he thought he had seen every possible reaction from fans. But on this particular autumn evening in October 2024, he was about to experience something that would remind him why he did what he did, and why every person he encountered carried a story worth hearing. Before we dive into this remarkable moment, if you enjoy stories about unexpected encounters that change lives, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue sharing these powerful human stories. Now, let me tell you what happened that night in Chicago. The Chicago Community Center had invited Steve to speak at their annual fundraising gala, an event that supported youth mentorship programs throughout the city. Steve had agreed months earlier, knowing that the organization did important work helping kids from disadvantaged neighborhoods find positive role models and career guidance. The event was scheduled to begin at 7 in the evening, but Steve had arrived early, around 5:30, wanting to see the facility and meet some of the young people who benefited from the programs. His security team and publicist had tried to keep the visit low-key, not wanting to create chaos before the formal event began. Steve had a habit of doing this, showing up early to places, observing quietly, getting a feel for the real work being done rather than just seeing the polished presentation prepared for donors. When Steve arrived, the community center was bustling with activity. Teenagers were practicing a step routine in the gymnasium. Younger children were working on art projects in one of the classrooms, and, in the main auditorium, a group of about 40 adults were participating in what appeared to be a support group meeting. Steve's publicist explained that the center offered not just youth programs but also adult services, including job training workshops, addiction recovery support groups, and mentorship training for adults who wanted to work with young people. The support group meeting in the auditorium was for men who were working to rebuild their lives after incarceration, learning how to become positive influences in their communities and families. Steve was immediately interested. He had long been passionate about criminal justice reform and second chances, having grown up in a neighborhood where he had seen too many good men make mistakes that defined their entire lives. Steve asked if he could observe the meeting without disrupting it. His publicist hesitated, concerned about protocol and privacy, but the center's director assured them that the group would likely be honored by his presence. As long as Steve was comfortable with the raw honesty that characterized these sessions, Steve agreed immediately. He had built his career on authenticity, and he had no interest in sanitized versions of people's struggles. The director led Steve, along with his security guard, to a side entrance of the auditorium where they could slip in quietly and sit in the back row without drawing attention. The lights were dimmed slightly for the meeting, and the men sitting in a circle at the front of the auditorium were focused intently on whoever was speaking, so Steve and his small group were able to take seats in the shadows without anyone noticing. The meeting was being facilitated by a counselor named Marcus, a man in his late 50s who spoke with the authority of someone who had walked the path these men were on. Marcus was going around the circle, asking each man to share something they were grateful for that week and one challenge they were still facing. The responses were heartbreakingly honest. One man was grateful he had made it 3 months without using drugs, but was struggling with the fact that his teenage daughter still refused to speak to him. Another was grateful he had found a job washing dishes at a restaurant, but was challenged by the fact that his paycheck barely covered his rent, leaving him unable to buy his son a birthday present. Each story revealed the complex reality of trying to rebuild a life after hitting bottom, the small victories that meant everything, and the persistent obstacles that threatened to drag these men back down. Then Marcus called on a man named Gerald Thompson. Gerald was 42 years old, though he looked older. He was a tall man with broad shoulders that seemed to carry an invisible weight. His hands were calloused from labor, and his face showed the lines of someone who had experienced more hardship than joy. When Marcus said his name, Gerald stood up slowly, as was apparently the custom in this group. He cleared his throat several times before speaking, and even from the back of the auditorium, Steve could see that Gerald was emotional. I am grateful that I am still here, Gerald began, his voice deep but shaky. 6 years ago, I did not think I would live to see 40. I was in prison, serving time for armed robbery, and I had given up. I had lost my family, lost respect for myself, lost any hope that my life could ever mean anything. I was just existing, counting days, waiting to die. Gerald paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. But something happened that changed everything. It sounds stupid saying it out loud, but it is the truth. I was in the common area one afternoon, and the television was on. Most of the guys were watching some action movie, but during a commercial break, a promo came on for Family Feud. Steve Harvey was on the screen, and he was talking to a family that had just won. The father of the family was crying because he said the money was going to help pay for his mother's surgery. And Steve Harvey looked at this man with such compassion, such genuine care, and he said something that I will never forget. He said, "Brother, we all stumble, but what matters is whether we get back up and keep fighting for the people we love." Gerald's voice broke completely now, and he had to take a moment to compose himself. The other men in the circle were nodding, several of them reaching out to touch Gerald's shoulder in support. Marcus, the facilitator, waited patiently, letting Gerald take his time. "I know Steve Harvey was not talking to me," Gerald continued. "He was talking to that man on his show, but in that moment, sitting in that prison common room, I felt like he was speaking directly to my soul. I had stumbled, that was certain. I had made terrible choices that hurt people I loved, but I had never asked myself if I was willing to get back up. I had just accepted that my life was over, that I was too far gone to be saved. But Steve Harvey's words, and the way he looked at that man with such belief in his ability to change, it made me think maybe I was not beyond redemption." Gerald sat back down, but he kept talking, and now the words were flowing more easily. "From that day forward, I started working on myself. I got my GED while I was inside. I took every rehabilitation program they offered, anger management, addiction counseling, job training. I wrote letters to my daughter apologizing for abandoning her when she needed me. Most of those letters came back unopened, but I kept writing them. I worked with the prison chaplain on understanding why I had made the choices I made, taking responsibility instead of blaming the world for my problems. When I got out 2 years ago, I was terrified. I had no money, no job prospects, no place to live except a halfway house. My ex-wife wanted nothing to do with me. My daughter, who was now 16, refused to see me. I had a record that made it almost impossible to get hired anywhere decent. But I remembered what Steve Harvey said. Get back up and keep fighting for the people you love. So that is what I did. I took a job at a warehouse making minimum wage, worked double shifts, saved every penny. I showed up at my daughter's school events even when she pretended not to see me. I volunteered here at this center, helping younger guys avoid the mistakes I made. Slowly, things started to change. Gerald's face brightened slightly as he continued. 3 months ago, my daughter finally agreed to have coffee with me. We sat in a Starbucks for 2 hours, and I let her tell me everything I had missed, every way I had hurt her, every moment I should have been there and was not. I did not make excuses. I just listened and apologized. Last week, she called me on her own, not because she had to but because she wanted to. She told me she was proud of me for turning my life around. And yesterday, he paused, his voice filled with wonder. Yesterday she asked if I would come to her senior recital next month. She is in the school choir, and she wants me there. The men in the circle erupted in supportive applause and encouraging words. Marcus was beaming with pride. Gerald held up his hand to indicate he was not finished. I know this sounds crazy, but I wish I could tell Steve Harvey what his words meant to me. He has no idea that a random thing he said on a game show 6 years ago literally saved my life. I watch Family Feud every day now. It reminds me that there are good people in the world, that families stick together, that second chances are possible. Every time I see Steve Harvey on that stage, I am reminded of the man I am trying to become, someone who lifts others up, who believes in people even when they do not believe in themselves. I will probably never get to meet him or thank him, but I want you all to know that if a broken man like me can find hope in a television show, then hope can be found anywhere. You just have to be open to receiving it. Gerald sat down, and Marcus asked if anyone else wanted to respond to what Gerald had shared. Several men spoke up, talking about their own sources of unexpected inspiration, the random moments or words that had redirected their paths. The discussion continued for another 20 minutes, but Steve Harvey was no longer listening to the other speakers. He was wiping tears from his own eyes, trying to process what he had just heard. His security guard had noticed Steve's emotional response and was looking at him with concern, but Steve waved him off. He needed a minute. He needed to understand the weight of what Gerald had said. Steve had spent decades in entertainment. He had done stand-up comedy, hosted radio shows, written books, and hosted multiple television programs. He had always tried to use his platform for good, to encourage people, to share wisdom he had learned through his own struggles. But he had never fully grasped the ripple effects of his words, the way a single sentence spoken to one person could reach someone else entirely and change the course of their life. The meeting was wrapping up. Marcus was giving final announcements about next week's session and reminding everyone about the gala that evening, mentioning that Steve Harvey would be the keynote speaker and encouraging the men to stay if they wanted to hear him, though he understood many had work or family obligations. Several of the men were gathering their belongings, preparing to leave, and Gerald was among them. He picked up a worn backpack and started walking toward the exit. Steve made a decision in that moment. He stood up from his seat in the back of the auditorium and started walking down the aisle toward the circle of chairs where the meeting had taken place. His movement caught the attention of a few men who were still standing near the front, and one of them did a double take, clearly recognizing Steve. The man nudged his friend, and within seconds, all the remaining men in the group had turned to see Steve Harvey walking toward them. Gerald had his back to the commotion, heading toward the side exit. He had not seen Steve yet. Marcus, the facilitator, looked shocked but recovered quickly, extending his hand as Steve approached. "Mr. Harvey, we did not expect you until later." Gerald heard Marcus say the name Harvey and assumed he was talking to someone else, perhaps a donor or volunteer also named Harvey. He was almost to the door when Steve called out, his voice carrying across the auditorium, "Gerald Thompson." Gerald froze. He turned slowly, confused about who would be calling his name in that tone, with that level of intensity. When his eyes found Steve Harvey standing in the center of the room, Gerald's face went through a transformation that Steve would never forget. First came confusion, then recognition, then absolute disbelief. Gerald's backpack slipped from his shoulder and hit the floor with a thud. He stood completely still, his mouth open, unable to form words. Steve walked toward Gerald, closing the distance between them. "Brother," Steve said gently, "I heard what you said. I was sitting in the back, and I heard every word." Gerald's legs seemed to give out, and he staggered backward until he hit the wall, using it for support. "This cannot be real," Gerald whispered. "You are not really here." "I am here," Steve said, now standing directly in front of Gerald. "And I need you to know something. What you just shared, about how my words reached you in prison, about how you turned your entire life around, that is why I do what I do. That is the whole point of everything." Gerald was crying openly now, not trying to hide it. "Mr. Harvey, I have imagined meeting you 1,000 times, but I never thought it would actually happen. I just wanted you to know that you saved my life." Steve reached out and pulled Gerald into an embrace. "No, brother. You saved your own life. I just said some words. You are the one who did the work. You are the one who chose to get back up. You are the one who fought your way back to your daughter. That is all you." The other men in the support group were watching this interaction with a mixture of awe and emotion. Several were recording on their phones, capturing this moment that felt sacred and surreal. Marcus was standing to the side, tears streaming down his face, understanding that he was witnessing something extraordinary. When Steve and Gerald finally pulled apart, Steve kept his hands on Gerald's shoulders. "Tell me about your daughter." "What is her name?" Steve asked. "Her name is Alicia," Gerald said, his voice still shaky. "She is 17 now, about to graduate high school. She wants to study nursing. She is so smart, so much smarter than I ever was. And she is giving you a second chance," Steve said. "That means she sees something worth believing in. Do not waste that gift. Gerald nodded emphatically. I will not, Mr. Harvey. I promise I will not. Steve smiled. Good. Now I need you to do me a favor. I am speaking at the gala here tonight, and I want you to be my guest. I want you sitting in the front row where I can see you, because you are going to help me remember why this work matters. Gerald looked panicked. Mr. Harvey, I cannot afford a ticket to that event. Those tables cost thousands of dollars. You are not buying a ticket, Steve said firmly. You are my personal guest, and I am going to tell your story tonight, with your permission, because people need to hear it. Gerald looked uncertain. I do not know if I want everyone knowing about my past, about prison and everything I did wrong. Steve nodded, understanding. I respect that. But let me ask you something. How many men are sitting in prison right now, just like you were 6 years ago, thinking their lives are over? How many have given up hope? What if your story is the thing that reaches them, the same way my words reached you? What if you can be for someone else what I accidentally was for you? Gerald considered this, the weight of Steve's words settling over him. You really think my story could help someone? He asked quietly. Brother, Steve said with conviction, I know it can. Gerald wiped his face and took a deep breath. Okay, if you think it will help, then yes, tell my story, but I have one condition. Steve raised an eyebrow. What is that? I want to bring my daughter. If I am going to share my journey publicly, I want Alicia there to see that her father is not ashamed of his past anymore, that he is trying to use it for good. Steve grinned. Now you are talking. Give me her contact information. I will have my assistant call her and arrange everything. In fact, I will send a car to pick you both up and bring you here tonight. Gerald looked overwhelmed. I do not even know what to say. Say you will keep doing the work, Steve replied. Say you will keep showing up for your daughter. Say you will keep being an example for these other men who are fighting the same battles you fought. That is all the thanks I need. The two men shook hands, a moment of connection that transcended their different backgrounds and circumstances. Steve turned to address the entire group of men who were still watching this interaction in stunned silence. Gentlemen, Steve began, his voice taking on the authoritative but warm tone that millions knew from his television shows. I want you to understand something. Every single one of you has a story worth telling. Every one of you has overcome things that other people cannot imagine. The fact that you are here, showing up to this group, working on yourselves, trying to build better lives, that takes more courage than most people will ever have to demonstrate. Do not let anyone tell you that your past defines your future. You define your future by the choices you make today and tomorrow and every day after that. The men were hanging on every word. Steve continued, I built my career on being funny, on making people laugh, and I am grateful for that. But the moments that mean the most to me are moments like this, when I get to see the real impact of trying to encourage people, trying to lift people up. Gerald's story, about how something I said years ago stayed with him and helped him change his life, that is the greatest reward I could ever receive. So I want to challenge each of you. Find someone who is where you used to be, someone who is struggling and lost and thinks there is no way forward. Share your story with them. Be for them what someone was for you. That is how we change the world, one conversation, one connection, one decision to keep fighting at a time. The group erupted in applause, and several men came forward to shake Steve's hand and thank him for his words. Steve spent the next 30 minutes talking with the men individually, learning their names and stories, offering encouragement and advice. His publicist was having a minor panic attack in the corner, worried about the schedule for the evening gala, but Steve ignored her. This was more important than any planned event. Finally, Steve told the group he needed to prepare for his speech, but that he hoped to see as many of them as possible at the gala. The center director assured him that arrangements would be made for any of the support group members who wanted to attend. As the men filed out of the auditorium, still buzzing with excitement about what had just happened, Steve pulled Gerald aside one more time. What time should I have the car pick you and Alicia up? Steve asked. Gerald looked uncertain. The event starts at 7, right? We could probably take the bus and be here by 6:30. Steve shook his head. No bus. I am sending a car at 6. That will give you time to get here, get settled, And meet some people before we start. And Gerald, one more thing. Do you own a suit? Gerald looked down at his work clothes, suddenly self-conscious. I have one suit that I wear to job interviews. It is a few years old, but it is clean. That is perfect, Steve said. You do not need anything fancy, just show up as yourself. That is who I want people to see. Gerald nodded, still looking somewhat dazed by everything that had happened in the past hour. Mr. Harvey, I need to say this before you go. 6 years ago, I was a man who had given up on himself. I had hurt everyone I loved, made choices I could not take back, and I could not see any path forward. Your words on that television show gave me something to hold on to when I had nothing else. But what you did today, taking the time to talk to me, to tell me my story matters, to include my daughter in this evening, that means more than you could possibly know. You did not have to do any of this. You could have stayed in the back of the room, left without anyone knowing you were here, but you chose to reach out to connect, to make me feel like I matter. Thank you does not seem like enough, but thank you. Steve felt his own eyes filling with tears again. Gerald, I need you to understand something. I am not a perfect man. I have made my share of mistakes, hurt people I should have protected, fallen short in ways that still haunt me. The difference between me and you is not that I am better or more worthy. The difference is that I got some breaks, some second chances that saved me before I fell as far as you did. You did the harder work. You climbed out of a deeper hole. You have every right to be proud of yourself, and I am honored to know you. The two men embraced again, and this time it felt like a friendship had been formed, not just a celebrity encounter, but a genuine connection between two people who understood struggle and redemption. Gerald left the auditorium walking taller than when he had entered, his entire demeanor transformed by the unexpected encounter with the man who had unknowingly inspired his transformation years earlier. Steve spent the next hour preparing for his keynote speech, but his mind kept returning to Gerald's story. He revised his prepared remarks, deciding to make Gerald's journey the centerpiece of his message. When the gala began at 7, the grand ballroom of the community center was filled with donors, community leaders, and local politicians. The tables were elegantly decorated, and the atmosphere was one of celebration and philanthropy. Steve sat at the head table, making polite conversation with the mayor and the center's board members, but his eyes kept scanning the room looking for Gerald. At 6:55, he saw them enter. Gerald was wearing a slightly oversized navy suit that had clearly seen better days, but he had paired it with a crisp white shirt and a tie that suggested he had made an effort. Next to him was a beautiful young woman who could only be Alicia. She had her father's height and her mother's features, with an elegant bearing that suggested confidence despite the obvious nervousness about being at such a formal event. Steve excused himself from the head table and walked directly to where Gerald and Alicia were standing, looking uncertain about where they should sit. Mr. Harvey, Gerald said, gesturing to his daughter, this is Alicia. Steve extended his hand to Alicia with genuine warmth. Miss Alicia, your father has told me so much about you. He is incredibly proud of you, and I can see why. You are giving him a gift that not every child would be willing to give, a second chance. That shows tremendous maturity and grace. Alicia looked surprised but pleased. Thank you, Mr. Harvey. My dad has worked really hard to make things right. I am proud of him too. Steve smiled. Good. That is exactly what he needs to hear. Now, I am going to have the staff seat you at the table right in front of the stage. I want to be able to see you both when I am speaking. I hope that is okay. Alicia looked at her father with excitement. Dad, we are sitting at the front table. This is insane. Gerald laughed. The first genuinely relaxed laugh Steve had heard from him. It is definitely not what I expected when I woke up this morning. Steve made sure Gerald and Alicia were settled at their table, even sitting with them for a few minutes to help them feel comfortable before the program began. He introduced them to some of the other guests at their table, framing Gerald as an important member of the center's mentorship program without mentioning his incarceration, allowing Gerald his dignity and privacy. When the formal program began, there were the usual elements of such events: welcome remarks from the center's director, a video showcasing the programs and the young people they served, acknowledgement of major donors, and then Steve's keynote address. When Steve was introduced and took the stage, he received a standing ovation. He thanked the audience graciously and then began to speak. Tonight, I was supposed to give you an inspirational speech about the importance of mentorship and second chances. I had prepared remarks about statistics and program outcomes and why your donations matter. And I will get to all of that, I promise. But something happened earlier this evening that reminded me what this work is really about, and I want to share it with you because I think you need to hear it. Steve gestured toward Gerald. In the audience tonight is a man named Gerald Thompson. Gerald, would you please stand up so everyone can see you? Gerald looked mortified but stood up slowly, with Alicia beaming beside him and squeezing his hand for support. The audience applauded politely, unsure of who Gerald was or why Steve was singling him out. 6 years ago, Steve continued, Gerald was serving time in prison for armed robbery. He had hit rock bottom. He had lost his family, his self-respect, and any hope for his future. He was, by his own admission, just waiting to die. But then something happened. He saw an episode of Family Feud where I spoke to a contestant about getting back up after you stumble. Gerald was not the contestant I was talking to. He was just a man in a prison common room, watching television, but my words reached him anyway, and they inspired him to make a change. Steve paused, letting the audience absorb this information. From that moment, Gerald started working on himself. He got his GED. He completed every rehabilitation program available. He took responsibility for his actions. When he was released 2 years ago, he got a job, volunteered at this very center, and worked tirelessly to rebuild his relationship with his daughter. And today, I had the privilege of meeting Gerald and hearing his story, not because he knew I was there, but because he was sharing it with his support group. Never expecting that I would hear how much my simple words had meant to him. Steve's voice grew emotional. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been in entertainment for over 30 years. I have won awards, achieved success by any measure society uses. But I will tell you right now, nothing I have ever accomplished means more than what Gerald told me today. Because he reminded me that our words matter, our actions matter, and we never know who is watching, who is listening, or who might be inspired to change their life because of something we say or do. Gerald is here tonight with his daughter Alicia. Steve gestured toward Alicia, who was now standing beside her father, both of them holding hands and crying. Gerald and Alicia are rebuilding their relationship. She is about to graduate high school and go to college to study nursing. She invited her father to her senior recital, which might not sound like a big deal to some of you, but for a man who thought he had lost his daughter forever, it is everything. Gerald gets to be a father again, not because I saved him, but because he chose to save himself. The audience was completely silent, captivated by the story. Steve continued, This is why your donations matter. This is why this center exists. Not to fix people, because people are not broken. They are struggling, they are hurting, they have made mistakes, but they are not broken. This center provides the support, the community, and the resources that allow people like Gerald to access the strength they already have inside themselves. When you write a check to support youth mentorship, you are not just helping kids. You are helping fathers like Gerald become the men their children need them to be. When you fund addiction recovery programs, you are giving families a chance to heal. When you support job training, you are creating pathways for people to rebuild their dignity and contribute to their communities. Steve looked directly at Gerald. Gerald, I want to thank you for sharing your story with me today, and for allowing me to share it with everyone here. You did not have to do that. You could have kept your past private, but you chose vulnerability and honesty because you believed it might help someone else. That is courage, brother. That is leadership. And that is exactly what this community needs more of. The audience erupted in applause, and soon everyone was on their feet giving Gerald a standing ovation. Gerald stood there, tears streaming down his face, with his daughter hugging him tightly. It was a moment of redemption, of recognition, of a man being seen for who he had become rather than who he had been. Steve continued speaking for another 20 minutes, weaving Gerald's story into his broader message about the power of second chances and the responsibility we all have to lift each other up. He challenged the wealthy donors in the room to see people like Gerald not as charity cases, but as proof of human resilience and potential. He asked them to imagine who else might be waiting for an opportunity, a word of encouragement, or a belief in their ability to change. By the time Steve finished his speech, the energy in the room had completely transformed. What had started as a typical fundraising gala had become something far more meaningful, a reminder of why this work mattered and what was possible when people refused to give up on each other. After the formal program ended, Steve spent over an hour talking with donors, but he noticed that many of them sought out Gerald as well, wanting to hear more of his story, asking how they could support men coming out of incarceration and offering resources and connections that might help. Gerald handled the attention with grace, always deflecting credit to the center's programs and the support group that had helped him stay accountable. Alicia stayed by her father's side the entire evening, and Steve could see the pride in her eyes every time her father spoke about his journey. Before the evening ended, Steve pulled Gerald and Alicia aside one final time. "I want to stay connected with you both. My assistant is going to get your contact information, and I am serious about that. I want to know how Alicia's recital goes. I want to hear about her college plans. And Gerald, I want you to keep me updated on your work with the mentorship program here. You have a story that needs to be shared, and I want to help you share it if you are willing." Gerald nodded enthusiastically. "Mr. Harvey, you have already done more for me than I could ever repay. But if you think my story can help others, then I am willing to share it wherever you think it will make a difference." Over the following months, Steve made good on his promise. He featured Gerald on his talk show, where Gerald shared his full story with a national audience. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people wrote in sharing their own redemption stories or expressing gratitude for the message of hope. Prison reform organizations reached out to Gerald, asking him to speak to inmates about the possibility of transformation. Gerald became a regular speaker at the community center's programs, mentoring young men who were at risk of making the same mistakes he had made. But perhaps most significantly, the relationship between Gerald and Alicia continued to deepen. Steve attended Alicia's senior recital as promised, sitting in the audience next to Gerald and watching as the young woman performed a solo that brought tears to her father's eyes. After the recital, Steve approached them both. "Alicia, you were magnificent up there. And Gerald, watching you watch your daughter, seeing the love and pride on your face, that is what redemption looks like. That is the whole point of the struggle." Gerald had grown more confident over the months since their first meeting, but he still seemed overwhelmed by Steve's continued involvement in their lives. "Mr. Harvey, I still cannot believe you came tonight. You have so many demands on your time, and yet you showed up for us." Steve put his hand on Gerald's shoulder. "Brother, you taught me something important. You reminded me that the words we speak matter, that we never know who is listening or how our message might reach them. You gave me a gift by sharing how something I said helped you change your life. The least I can do is show up when you invite me to see the results of that change. This is what success looks like. Not the money or the fame, but this, being able to be present for moments that matter to people who matter." Alicia graduated with honors and received a full scholarship to nursing school, in part due to connections Steve had helped facilitate through his network. Gerald continued his work at the community center and eventually was hired as a full-time staff member, overseeing the reentry program for formerly incarcerated individuals. 2 years after their initial meeting, Gerald married his girlfriend Sarah, who had met him through his volunteer work at the center. Steve attended the wedding, giving a toast that brought everyone to tears. He spoke about how Gerald's willingness to share his vulnerability that day in the support group, not knowing Steve was listening, had created ripples that extended far beyond what anyone could have imagined. He talked about how genuine transformation requires courage not just to change but to let others witness that change, to risk being seen at your worst so that others can see what growth is possible. As this remarkable story reaches its conclusion, it serves as a powerful reminder that we never fully know the impact of our words and actions. Steve Harvey spoke encouraging words to a contestant on a game show, never imagining those words would reach a man in prison and alter the entire trajectory of his life. Gerald shared his story in what he thought was a private support group meeting, never imagining that the very man who had inspired him was sitting in the shadows listening. That unexpected convergence, that moment when Gerald realized Steve Harvey had heard his testimony, became a catalyst for even greater transformation, not just for Gerald but for everyone who heard his story thereafter. The community center where this all began saw a significant increase in funding and support following Steve's keynote address, allowing them to expand their programs and serve more families. The support group for formerly incarcerated men grew from 40 members to over 100 as word spread about the compassionate, judgment-free environment where men could work on becoming better versions of themselves. Gerald's story inspired legislative changes at the state level, with policymakers citing his journey as evidence that reentry programs and second-chance employment initiatives were investments worth making. If this story touched your heart, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing these powerful reminders of human resilience and redemption. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it is never too late to change, that redemption is always possible, and that the words we speak in encouragement may reach further than we ever imagine. The encounter between Steve Harvey and Gerald Thompson stands as testament to the truth that we are all connected in ways we cannot fully comprehend, that moments of crisis can become moments of transformation, and that sometimes the most profound impact we have on others comes not from grand gestures, but from simple words spoken with genuine compassion. Gerald Thompson thought Steve Harvey would never hear his story of transformation, never know how much those game show words had mattered to a desperate man in prison. But Steve did hear, and he responded not with celebrity detachment, but with human connection, recognizing that he and Gerald were both simply men trying to do good in the world, each learning from the other about what truly matters in life. Their story continues to inspire thousands who hear it, reminding us all that hope can be found in unexpected places, that change is always possible, and that showing up authentically, vulnerably, and courageously can create ripples of transformation that extend far beyond anything we might imagine.